World War II is over. We won. And now we all just wanted to get back to the way things used to be. Except that not everyone wanted to go back to normal. I know this might shock you, but the good old days weren't good for everyone. World War II had opened up opportunities and conversations about freedom and discrimination that couldn't just be put back in the box. First of all, there was the fact that the US was expressly fighting against an undemocratic government that preached ethnic supremacy while oppressing and killing minorities. In contrast to both Nazi Germany and militaristic Japan, we were supposed to be the good guys. So it became a little awkward when we took a look in the mirror and remembered that we weren't treating Black Americans and other people of color that much better. Like, to figure out how to gradually and legally remove rights from German Jews, Nazi lawyers literally studied the American Jim Crow South and the treatment of Indigenous Americans on Indian reservations. We were their model. Meanwhile, Americans of color had risked their lives to fight for the idea of freedom overseas. They had proven themselves in the war and gained community and confidence that's going to embolden them when they come back home. Now, here's just a few facts and figures for you. 500,000 Hispanic Americans and 500,000 Jewish Americans served in the war. 1/3 of all able-bodied Native Americans served. The most decorated unit in the history of the US military was the 442nd Regiment, an all-Japanese American regiment that fought in Europe. Of 14,000 second-generation Japanese Americans, the unit earned 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Star Medals, and 21 Medals of Honor. The most famous Black Americans to serve in the war were the Tuskegee Airmen. Before the war, there was a widespread belief among the military that Black Americans were not smart enough to learn to fly sophisticated aircraft. But with a war in two theaters, the Air Force needed all the pilots they could get, and they started begrudgingly training a small group of Black pilots. As always, Eleanor Roosevelt helped the cause. Hey, Eleanor. She visited the Tuskegee Airfield in 1941, taking photographs and riding on an aerial tour with some of the airmen. And because FDR always eventually listened to his wife, he ordered that Black Americans be allowed into combat for the first time broadly since the Civil War. The Tuskegee Airmen eventually flew 15,000 individual attacks across Europe and North Africa, earning 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and over 200 missions. They didn't lose a single pilot to enemy fire. Soon after, in 1943, FDR ordered all military bases to be integrated, and by the end of the decade, not by the end of the war, the US Army would be fully desegregated. Now, arguably, the military was the easiest aspect of American society to change, right? In times of crisis, the color of people's skin doesn't matter as much, especially when you have a fairly enlightened commander-in-chief. But Black Americans recognized that earning their rights outside the military would be more difficult, but many leaders used the rhetoric of the war to spark what's going to become the civil rights movement. Because way more than Eleanor, Black Americans began calling for the double V, a victory over racism abroad and another victory over racism at home. Leading this charge was labor leader A. Philip Randolph. In 1937, he had organized the first official African-American labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he used his influence to push for job equality during the war. When the war began, Randolph told President Roosevelt that he was organizing a March on Washington to advocate for Black Americans in the workforce. Wanting to avoid divisions at home while mobilizing for war abroad, FDR quickly issued Executive Order 8802 in 1941, decreeing that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. Basically, if you were a business that had a government contract, which was a lot of companies at this point, you could not discriminate on the basis of race. As part of this, FDR also created the Fair Employment Practices Commission to make sure the defense industry was following his order. This commission marks the first federal civil rights agency created since Reconstruction. What? After the war, A. Philip Randolph continued the momentum. He's going to organize the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience Against Military Segregation. Long name, but it worked. In 1948, President Truman banned racial segregation in the armed forces, and Randolph would later become a mentor to future civil rights leaders, helping organize the 1963 March on Washington, where a guy named King has a dream. More on him later. So, desperate times called for desperate measures. Factory owners, God forbid, had to start hiring minorities, since so many of the white male workforce was off fighting Nazis and storming beaches. And many business owners went even further and hired women. Whoa. Before we get to Rosie the Riveter, it's important to note that World War II was the first time that women were also allowed to enlist in the military. Although they were barred from combat, that ban wouldn't be removed until 2013, by the way. Over 68,000 women served overseas as nurses, and 300 women flew as service pilots. Another 4 million women were hired by the government to take over clerical and administrative jobs in the military that freed up men to go fight. And even more women found better work across the private sector. The number of working women increased from 12 to 18.8 million by the end of the war, and most of this growth came from non-traditional working women, like many of them were married with children. And while the most famous image we have of women in the war is Rosie the Riveter, the majority of women worked behind a desk. But it's true that 2.5 million women did take up more manual labor in shipyards, aircraft factories, and manufacturing plants. And it's at this point that I would also like to mention that to encourage this growing workforce, the federal government funded a nationwide daycare program to support working mothers. What a concept. Spending the equivalent of $1 billion today, the government oversaw the creation of 3,000 childcare centers and eventually served 500,000 children. Now, when women's rights advocates petitioned for that program to continue after the war, they were mostly ignored. Daycare was a wartime necessity, the government argued, but the best care for a young child was at home with their mother. So obviously, the patriarchal power structures expected everything to go back to normal after the war was over. And it's true that many minorities lost their jobs once white workers returned, and many women left the workforce entirely, some willingly and others unwillingly. But after 4 years of the most productive economy we've ever seen, fueled by minority and female labor, it just became harder for people to argue that those groups were somehow less capable than white men. I mean, they still do it, but it's hard. World War II would prove to be the spark that started the modern civil rights movements that are going to explode in the 1960s. Black Americans unified behind a common rhetoric that held up American hypocrisy, and women had proved they could do it all, and other marginalized groups found community for the first time as they moved in even larger numbers to big cities and found slivers of opportunity. All these groups, from people of color to women to the LGBTQ+ community, had seen glimpses of a world not dominated by white men, and they were not going to allow things to return to the so-called good old days. But what is going on more generally in the years just after World War II? Well, while the United States after World War I experienced racial tension, communist fears, and disillusionment, the United States after World War II experienced racial tension, communist fears, and patriotism? That's growth, I guess. No one can deny that the United States after World War II was the most dominant superpower in the world. Well, I guess the Soviet Union is going to try to deny that. We'll get to you later, commies. As Winston Churchill put it in 1945, America at this moment stands at the summit of the world. And this, of course, is the moment of the boom. What was the boom? It's a lot of things. Demographically, we're talking about a baby boom. In 1946, just after the war ended, a record 3.4 million babies were born in the United States. Throughout the 1950s, 4 million babies were born each year. By the end of the baby boom in 1964, there were 77 million new, young baby boomers. I love comparing this to the post-World War I era when men returning from war were like moving to Paris to write existential novels. I'm looking at you, Hemingway. But after World War II, soldiers come home and are like, "Where's my wife? Let's have 5 kids and buy a big house in the suburbs." Now, the other part of the boom is the economy. Between 1945 and 1960, the US GNP doubled from 200 billion to 500 billion. It's called the golden age of American capitalism, except that's a little misleading. A lot of people remember the post-World War II era this way. Everyone just got back to work, rolled up their sleeves, and made a lot of money. Capitalism wins. But we forget that a lot of this economic boom was fueled by high taxes and massive government spending. The government is going to build interstate highways, schools, distribute veterans benefits, and they massively increased its spending on military materials and technology. Unemployment and inflation were low and wages were high, and a college education was affordable and accessible to the middle class. And probably the most iconic imagery of the boom is the new suburban developments, or suburbs. Mass production was applied to housing, as the government, using this new GI Bill, subsidized mortgages for returning soldiers to buy a home in the burbs for often less than it would cost to rent an apartment in the city. And since auto workers were mostly back to making cars instead of tanks, suburban families could have a car to get anywhere interesting. I mean, no offense, suburbs, but you get it. It's kind of boring out there. The GI Bill is really interesting because in some ways it's like the last gasp of the New Deal. It was one of the last major pieces of legislation signed by FDR just weeks after D-Day began. First of all, I really like this flex. Like, we're still fighting two wars essentially, but Roosevelt's like, yeah, I know they'll be coming home soon. Let's take care of them. Now, the problem with the GI Bill and the boom in general was that it was mostly isolated to, well, you guessed it, white people. Officially, the GI Bill was supposed to apply to every veteran, including the 1.2 million Black people who served their country. But in order to get the bill passed, FDR had to make a lot of deals with the Southern Democrats who were ruling over Jim Crow. They insisted that these programs should be administered by the individual states instead of the federal government, which meant that the GI Bill just kind of got lumped into all the other Jim Crow era loopholes that excluded Black citizens from getting their promised rights. A quick note about Southern Democrats. They're a political faction that you're going to be hearing a lot about in the next few episodes. So essentially, the New Deal coalition of Democrats was so huge that it included people of many races all across the country, and they all unified behind FDR's vision of a government that more actively supported the working class and farmers. However, remember that for most of American history, politics was way more about your wallet than personal beliefs about society or culture. So white Democrats in the South were overwhelmingly also segregationists, which is weird because they technically were in the same political party as Black Southerners who had finally left the Republican Party of Lincoln during the New Deal. And that's why we always need to make a distinction with Southern Democrats, sometimes called Dixiecrats, using an old nickname for the Confederacy. These are white Southerners who are fine with big government to build the economy, but only if that same big government stays out of their local business, i.e., white supremacist oppression of people of color. And the only way the New Deal coalition is going to hold, especially once FDR is gone, is with presidents who appeal to that Southern Democrat group, which is going to be really frustrating for anyone who would like to see the president of the United States make quicker headway on civil rights issues. I'm looking at you, Kennedy. Anyway, we'll come back to them later, but even if a Black veteran could get GI Bill tuition money, they still had to get accepted into a university, which was difficult, considering that many had a cap on how many Black students they would allow to be admitted each year. And it was essentially impossible in many places for Black families to get home loans. Many banks refused to lend to Black men regardless of the guarantees of the GI Bill. In some cases, it was their stated policy to not lend to anyone within a historically Black neighborhood. You see, a decade before the GI Bill was passed, at the height of the Great Depression, the federal government was attempting to solve a housing crisis. There were not enough homes in the cities, and so they tried to prioritize giving support to families and areas that were deemed a safer financial investment. Other parts of town were redlined, which meant the federal government identified them as a risky investment for bankers. Uncoincidentally, these districts were overwhelmingly filled with people of color, who were often living in debt cycles of renting apartments and homes that they could never afford to buy. This practice basically meant that the federal government identified people of color as a financial risk to banks and encouraged lenders to save their precious resources for more stable, read white, investment opportunities. Now, back to the 1940s, even if a Black family could get a home loan, most suburban developments had restrictive covenants that banned Black families from buying homes in their area. Redlining homeowners associations were often created with the purpose of creating rules and guidelines that made it impossible for Black families to move in. Real estate agents would sometimes just refuse to show homes to Black families. And all of this meant that at a critical moment, when an entire generation of working and middle-class white families were able to buy their first home and create wealth that would grow and be passed down, Black families were overwhelmingly excluded. And the suburbs are going to become the primary destination for white families looking to escape the growing civil rights movement. Because what's going on in those cities, right? In the 1950s, society is going to be changing as televisions enter most homes, broadcasting Elvis shaking his hips, beatnik poets talking about sex, and Black people fighting oppression. For context, the Montgomery Bus Boycott of Rosa Parks and Dr. King fame began just 9 years after the end of World War II. In that same year, Brown versus the Board of Education is going to declare school segregation unconstitutional. And although most southern states will refuse to integrate for decades, the all-white suburbs will provide a really easy way to avoid the issue entirely by just abandoning the more diverse urban centers where change was occurring more quickly. Next time you're driving through a suburb, look for the welcome signs. More often than not, you'll learn that those suburbs are technically separate towns that were incorporated sometime in the 1950s or 60s. By separating from the city entirely, they could create their own local administration and municipalities, which segregated society even further. And honestly, it's this type of informal loophole segregation that's going to be way harder to undo because it's not as obvious if you aren't paying attention, and it's going to become generational. That's just the way things are. Of course, the other group that lost out on some of the big promises of the post-war world were women. Rosie the Riveter was cute and all when we were at war, but afterwards most husbands, and the government, didn't want their wives still leaving their domestic responsibilities for a job. Ugh. Most of the 18 million women who were in the workforce at the end of the war were laid off, or they chose to leave their jobs and go back home. But the images of women working in traditionally all-male jobs stuck with many people in society who were like, maybe a woman can do the same things as a man. However, white women who had joined the armed services did get many of the benefits of the GI Bill as well. Women couldn't get their own loans in most parts of the country, so that point was moot. But over 65,000 female veterans attended college through the government program. Unfortunately, overall, there were actually fewer women in college at this time because universities decided to make space for male veterans by limiting how many women they admitted. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Just like during the Industrial Revolution, for many middle and upper class women, the boom further confined their opportunities. Now these women were out in the suburbs, away from the bustle of city life, often without their own car to get around, since the husband needed it to get to work. And women's books and magazines exploded, full of advice about marrying young, cooking pot roasts, and welcoming your husband home with a full face of makeup and a martini for him. This message was not new, but there was something different now. Many women had experienced the full extent that American society had to offer her. She'd had a job that gave her a sense of purpose beyond family life, and she had spending money of her own. And the television is going to open up other opportunities and experiences. Many women throughout the 1950s are going to begin to experience what Betty Friedan will call in the 60s the feminine mystique of the housewife, who had everything she'd been told she should want, but still felt like there was something more. As Friedan will put it, the suburbs were burying women alive. But none of that was very important to the government, because as soon as we defeated Hitler, we came face to face with our next enemy, and he was everywhere. In the anti-war poems of the beatniks and the pleas for equality of early civil rights leaders, in women who chose not to marry, and Hollywood actors who refused to make exclusively patriotic content. That's right, it's about to get really cold in here. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.